Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Zooming into Scripture. So, today I'm going to be diving into a series that will eventually cover all of the Gospels, but today we'll just be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. So, for thousands of years, this Gospel has been attributed to the disciple of Jesus named Matthew, who was a tax collector prior to following him. Keep this detail in mind as it will be important later. But today, many skeptics of the Bible have claimed that the Gospel authors, including Matthew, were anonymous and not written by the names attributed to them. So is this true? And is there any good reason to believe this? Well, let's see what the internal and external evidence shows, and then we can make a decision from there once the evidence has been gathered. So first, let's look at the external and physical evidence surrounding the authorship of Matthew and narrow down our potential candidates for authorship. So first up, we have Matthew, formerly known as Levi, who was a tax collector, as mentioned before, and then later a disciple of Jesus. And next we have no one. That is right. Believe it or not, there are no competing names, and there are no copies of Matthew or any other gospel for that matter under any name than the authors Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Historian Craig Evans states this: in every single text that we have where the beginning or the ending of the work survives, we find the traditional authorship. There are no anonymous copies of the Gospels, and there are no copies of the canonical Gospels under different names. Unless evidence to the contrary should surface, we should stop talking about anonymous Gospels. Immediately, the evidence points strongly to Matthew being the author of Matthew, and with no other competing author, the only other plausible option would be anonymous authorship. But even that is looking less likely considering no anonymous copies of the gospel exist. But we still have more external evidence to consider, so let's now look at what people close in history to the time period have to say about who wrote this gospel. So our first early source indicating the author of Matthew is Papias, who lived from 60 AD to 130 AD. He writes this: Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. We also have Irenaeus, who lived from 130 AD to 202 AD, who writes this: Matthew produced a written gospel for the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome, laying the foundations for the church there. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed down to us in writing what Peter had preached. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel Paul preached. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had leaned upon his breast, also published a gospel while he was living at Ephesus. I think that's how you say it. And that is in Against Heresies. So some of you may have noticed that both Papias and Irenaeus have Matthew writing the original book of Matthew in Hebrew. Now, unfortunately, there are no remaining copies of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew or Aramaic, but we do know that they existed because of Eusebius. And he wrote this in the church histories. And I'm not going to attempt that name. I've tried. I keep messing it up. So we'll just continue. Just pretend I'm saying it. Was one of these and is said to have gone to India. It is reported that among persons there who knew of Christ, he found the gospel according to Matthew, which had anticipated his own arrival. For Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached to them and left with them the writing of Matthew in the Hebrew language, which they had preserved till that time. So what can we gather from all of this? Well, it's pretty clear that the church fathers unanimously identify that Matthew was indeed the author. So everything is pointing to Matthew so far. The manuscripts, the early sources, the church fathers. But let's look at some internal evidence and see if we can get any clues that point to the identity of the author. So the book of Matthew connects to a Jewish audience more than any other gospel and references the Hebrew Bible, showing Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy regarding the Messiah. The author's extensive knowledge of the Hebrew Bible would strongly point to a Jewish author, seeing that it would be unlikely that anyone else would have that much knowledge about the Hebrew Bible. So that would make sense. But that's not the only thing found in the book of Matthew that would indicate who the author is. The book of Matthew is also the only gospel that contains financial details, such as Matthew 27, verse 24, which refers to the temple tax. So that is something that would make sense, that would stick out to Matthew, who, as mentioned before, was a tax collector. So this perfectly fits his background. So let's look at all the evidence we have covered and see if there is really any good reason to be skeptical of Matthew's authorship. So first, the early church unanimously agrees that Matthew was indeed the author. And 2, manuscript evidence supports Matthew's authorship. 3, though not explicitly stated in the text, internal clues point to a Jewish author who added financial details not found in the other Gospels, which would make sense given Matthew's background. There just isn't any good reason to believe that Matthew didn't write Matthew. In fact, it would seem, given all the facts, denying Matthew's authorship would be going in spite of the facts, not because of them. Well, thanks for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like. I try to upload every week, and your guys' feedback really keeps me motivated to continue making these videos for you guys. And yeah, so I will see you guys next week.